the reality is that if you're just telling people, let's hang out and talk about ethics, it's just not doing the same kind of thing that an institution that's trying to sort of prepare people for virtuous behavior through the life cycle with an eye towards your eventual destination after death is doing.
Hello, and welcome to the Shifting Culture podcast, in which we have conversations about the culture we create and the impact we can make. We long to see the body of Christ look like Jesus. I'm your host, Joshua Johnson. In a world that often feels fragmented, uncertain, and spiritually empty, what if belief isn't just possible, but essential? Today, I'm sitting down with Ross Douthat, New York Times columnist and one of our most nuanced cultural thinkers, to explore a radical proposition: why everyone should be religious in an age of growing skepticism. We're going beyond the debates of belief versus non-belief. This conversation dives into the mysteries at the heart of the human experience, from quantum physics that suggests the universe might be more intentional than we thought, to near-death experiences that challenge everything we understand about consciousness. Douthat brings a provocative, intellectually rigorous perspective that defies easy categorization. We'll explore how ancient spiritual wisdom might hold profound answers for our hyper-individualized, technology-driven world. How can religious thinking help us navigate complexity, find meaning, and reconnect with something larger than ourselves? Expect surprises. We'll uncover scientific discoveries that point toward design, discuss supernatural experiences that defy materialist explanations, and wrestle with life's deepest questions. Whether you're a committed believer, a curious skeptic, or someone feeling spiritually lost, this episode promises to expand your understanding and offer a message of hope. We're not just talking about belief, we're reimagining what it means to be human in a mysterious universe. So join us. Here is my conversation with Ross Douthat. Ross, welcome to Shifting Culture. Excited to have you on. Thank you so much for joining me.
You're very welcome. Thank you so much for having me.
I'm excited to dive into your book, Believe, Why Everyone Should Be Religious, and your case for religion. I would like to know, as we start, how did we get here? What is the state of the world? And I want to go back pretty far. Let's go back to what was the organizing thought, life, belief before Copernicus and Darwin, and then what shifted and changed to move us into, I think, a secular type of non-belief world that we currently sit in?
It's a good question. We'll try and cover, 500 to 1,000 years of history in brisk fashion. I think the simplest way to look at it, especially in the context of the arguments I'm making in the book, is that for most of human history, in most societies and civilizations, there was a default to a view that the universe existed for some reason, that there was some deep relationship between mind and matter, where mind in some form was primary. This could take the form of a creator god. It could take the form of a kind of pantheistic conception where mind and the universe are sort of bound together in some way. But, there was some sense of order and design and intentionality in the cosmos. There was some sense of a kind of spiritual hierarchy in which human beings existed that also included a spirit world that, might include the local spirits associated with the tribe in a primitive society, might include a pantheon of gods in a polytheistic society, might include saints and angels in medieval Christendom. And then there was an assumption that human life continued in some form, maybe a more fulfilled form, maybe a more attenuated form, but continued in some form after death, and that your conduct in this life, your relationship to higher powers in this life had some kind of relationship to some kind of eternal destiny. So that's, again, we're glossing a lot of different pictures, but I also think you could say then there was also a certain kind of convergence between the major religious traditions, right? That obviously Buddhism, Hinduism, Christianity, Islam, retained a lot of significant differences, but you could still see similarities, certainly in their ethical codes that, emerged in the first millennium BC, and then afterward with Christianity and Islam, ethical convergence, what C.S. Lewis calls in one of his books, the Tao, this sort of, common moral inheritance of the major religious traditions. You have some convergence on ideas about heaven and hell and life after death, even though Eastern religions believe in reincarnation and Western religions don't. Both religions believe in some kind of heaven and some kind of hell after death. And, and you have certain kinds of philosophical convergences where you can find Hindu philosophers and mystics meditating on the nature of God who say things that can sound a lot like Western mystics and philosophers, again, notwithstanding real theological differences. So that's a picture of the religious world. So then what happens to that world, I think it's an interesting and complicated question, because you have a series of, in the Western world, scientific revolutions that, pose particular challenges to particular aspects of Western Christianity, right? The Copernican revolution changes the basic conception of how the universe is put together and where Earth fits among the planets. And then Darwinism poses a specific challenge, I think, to Christian ideas about the fall of man, the book of Genesis, the origin of the human race. So there are those scientific challenges. Then there's obviously a kind of, a sort of political process in the Western world whereby new states and governments, sort of compete with one another and are in conflict and tension with religious authorities in ways that sort of create church-state debates, the secular versus the sacred, all of these things that themselves play some important role in weakening religion's hold. And then you have certain, broad social transformations, industrialization, the end of the agrarian world, and then beyond industrialization, the revolutions for the last 50 or 60 years, the sexual revolution, the cultural revolutions associated with it, that sort of alienate modern people from a lot of the traditional, or at least some of the traditional moral teachings of the faith. So I think in talking about how the world became more secular, you have to see, yes, there's a scientific dimension, there's a scientific challenge to certain religious ideas, there's a political dimension, there's a social and moral dimension, and then finally there's just, and this is and relates to the argument I'm making in the book, there's just sort of the fact of modern pluralism, right? Like, modernity, it's not just liberalism, it's globalization, it's, a whole host, communications technology, a whole host of trends just brings people into contact with the diversity of religious traditions for the first time fully, unless you're Marco Polo in most of human history. And that change, I think, creates sort of an extra burden for people in sort of either sticking with or choosing a particular religion, a sense that like particularity seems, if not a mistake, it's more unlikely, right? That any particular one faith could be the one true faith in the way that, again, certainly various forms of Christianity and Islam would claim to be.
That's really helpful to get us
6 minutes, 1,000 years of history. Yeah.
What has been then some of the scientific discoveries and the way that we have seen the cosmos and the order of the universe? What are some of those discoveries that have started to point then maybe this isn't just an accident that has happened? Maybe there is something, a mover at the beginning. There is a creator.
Yeah, I mean, I think the shift in evidence in that direction, you could say, in part, it just reflects realities that were always there and have been integral to modern science from the beginning. If you go back to the first few centuries of the modern scientific era, most scientists, while they might have been heretical Christians, heterodox Christians, very eccentric Christians in the case of Sir Isaac Newton, most or all of them took for granted the idea that there was some ordering power to the universe, and that they were discovering an order that was discoverable precisely because it was designed, right? And science would make less sense if you assume that the universe was accidental and random, because why would we be able to discover regular, consistent physical and mathematical laws that made sense of it if it was just random and accidental. So that there was that synthesis originally, and versions of that evidence still remain, right? Like the fact that, science works and discovers laws and predictable realities and beautiful mathematical symmetries. That was always there, even, at sort of, the peak of certain forms of materialist and atheistic science. But the shifts in the last 70 to 100 years starts with the realization that the universe probably had a beginning, the Big Bang, right? And, there's debate about whether that's the only beginning. Maybe universes emerge and die. But prior to the Big Bang being sort of widely accepted, it was the concept of an eternal universe seemed more consonant with atheism than does a universe that has a beginning, a moment of creation, much like what's described in, say, the book of Genesis. And then, moving from there, you entered into some of the weirder discoveries of quantum physics, whose interpretation, I think, will be, debated for centuries yet to come. But one of the simplest readings of what quantum physics seemed to reveal about reality was that there was some mysterious interplay between observation and reality, between the conscious scientist doing measurement and whether sort of reality collapsed from contingencies and possibilities into a singular reality. So there seemed to be a sort of spooky connection between mind and matter that takes us a bit out of the purely clockwork universe model. And then above all, you had a series of discoveries about the ways in which the laws and constants of this universe were set up that suggested what people now call fine-tuning. The idea that there were, literally quadrillions of possible universes in which it was impossible for anything like human life to ever develop. And that our universe was set in a kind of Goldilocks jackpot zone. Those are the kind of phrases that people talking about this use, where one constant is set exactly here and another is set exactly there, all of which is necessary to produce basic order, stars, planets, and eventually life itself. And that has left us in this curious position where the alternative to a design hypothesis, some kind of, prime mover and so on coming back into the picture, is theories about a multiverse, right? Where in effect, the hardened materialist is left to insist that the reason we exist as we do is that there is a near infinity of other universes out there, all somehow invisible to us, that are necessary to explain the one we have. That's not a dynamic where it's clear that the materialist paradigm has, any kind of claim to represent the kind of parsimonious, hard-headed alternative to wild thoughts about a creating God. In some ways, people argue about this, but in some ways, the argument from design seems like the much more parsimonious explanation for why our universe appears to be ordered with us in mind.
Hey friends, it's Joshua here, and I just want to take a quick moment to tell you about Shifting Culture Productions. If you've got a podcast, you're thinking about starting one, or you're dreaming up another creative venture, we're here to help bring your vision to life. From production and coaching to strategy and supports, we'll work alongside you to get your project off the ground and thriving. Let's partner together to create something impactful. To schedule a call and learn more about pricing, just email me at jjohnson@allnations.us. I'd love to hear about your ideas and see how we can make them happen. Let's create something amazing together. Reach out today. That's good. The multiverse, the one thing I do know about the multiverse is it has made Marvel movies worse. And
Yes. It's an interesting thing where it has been adopted into pop culture, right? And it is a case study in how even, the speculations, the most sort of, abstruse speculations of physicists and philosophers eventually find their way into Marvel movies. But they see it as it's like a cheat code, right? It's like, okay, we got bored with this storyline, we can just reset it. It's actually much better for drama, and this you can draw theological conclusions or not from this, to have just one timeline that can't just be reset every time everyone gets bored.
And I mean, this is the story of who we are. I think it makes sense and meaning of our lives. So if we have a story of a purposelessness, we have a story that there is just randomness everywhere. It seems to me that there's definitely been a rise in anxiety, depression. There's been a rise in malaise of not knowing if there's anything here. I think some people have thought that, hey, once we get rid of religion, we could organize into other groups and we could still find some meaning in the world, and we'll be okay, and maybe we'll be even better than the institutions that we have left behind. So why has that not really panned out well? And why do you think religion is a better answer?
A couple reasons, right? One reason is just the sort of, the practical reality that the claims that religion makes are more likely to inspire the kind of pro-social behaviors that even some secular people miss when religion declines, right? So there have been endless attempts to set up communities, congregational communities organized around, let's say, the ethics of Christianity without the supernaturalism, right? Some of these have a kind of quasi-religious component, right? And many of them do not. The ethical culture societies, which still exist, by the way, the sort of various atheist societies and humanist societies and so on have tried to do these things. And the reality is that if you're just telling people, let's hang out and talk about ethics, it's just not doing the same kind of thing that an institution that's trying to sort of prepare people for virtuous behavior through the life cycle with an eye towards your eventual destination after death is doing, right? Like, what does a funeral look like at the Ethical Culture Society, right? What does a bar mitzvah or bat mitzvah look like in these kind of secular religions? I think it's obvious that you can do things like that, do rites of passage and initiation and so on, but they just aren't going to have the same power and draw people in the same way. And so those institutions are weaker and therefore don't do the things, the sort of Alexis de Tocquevillian, social society building things that religious institutions do. The other thing, and this, you can see this, I think, play out just in the last 15 years, right, is that secular alternatives to religion are more appealing, naturally more appealing, if they can promise definitively some kind of better world, maybe not paradise, but at least a better world in the here and now, right? The idea that you don't need religion because we have progress, right? You don't need heaven because we're getting toward heaven on earth, right? And this was obviously the tremendous appeal of Marxism for so long, right? The Marxism said, you don't need religion because good news, the iron laws of history, the science, the science of socialist materialism tells you that if you do these things, if you work for the revolution, you will get a better world, a transformed world, if not a heavenly world, the next best thing, right? If you don't have that kind of confidence, then it's harder to sustain a kind of secular form of faith. And just in American life, right? Like, it was easier to be a secular liberal progressive in the time when Barack Obama was elected president, and it seemed like there was a permanent Democratic majority and that the future belonged to liberalism, than has been in the age of populism and Donald Trump and various defeats for liberalism, things not going liberalism's way, right? And it's not a surprise that secular progressivism would become more pessimistic and despairing when it's losing politically, because politics is all, in the end, that secular progressivism has as a place to vest your hope. So in microcosm, what's happened in the last 15 or 20 years is the larger problem with secular utopianisms. They're great when, maybe not great, but they're okay when things are getting better or seem to be getting better. But if you have setbacks, then you're thrown back on the depressing reality that it's a meaningless universe. And what's your succor and what's your help?
Exactly. I think, my friend talks about the old ways, the ancient religions, as ancient wells. And my question then is, why, when a lot of people think about progress and moving forward, going into the future, Why do you think religion is something that has been around for centuries and centuries, and they are ancient wells of wisdom and understanding for our world? Do we reach back as we are moving and propelling forward into the future?
I mean, I think that part of the assumption is that basic questions about human life are persistent and permanent across different eras, right? You can't just sort of, just to take the basic question, like, what happens to people after they die, right? Like, presumably, if that question has an answer, it's not radically altered by the Industrial Revolution, the rise of the iPhone, or anything like that, right? Questions of morality, maybe you could say, are a little different. Moral landscape looks different in a pre-industrial society than it does in a post-industrial society. But I don't think anyone thinks it looks that different, right? The questions of what it means to live a good life. There's a reason that people still read, there's a reason that Buddhism, Buddhist styles of meditation can seem deeply relevant to the most harried modern person, even though they developed in a completely different cultural, political, and social context, right? So there is just sort of a permanent set of human issues that don't go away and that require, in a sense, some form of reaching back and rediscovery when we sort of go through a period where we think that we've sort of transcended the need for them. Now, I would say two other things, though. One is that, that reaching back and rediscovery is never just sort of a pure, a pure sort of return to the past, right? All eras of religious revival or religious ferment are eras in which things from the past are sort of brought back, but they're also reshaped and remade and made new, right? And this is even true of sort of forms of religion that appear, steeped in ancient tradition, right? Like just in my own Catholic Church, a lot of what, Latin Mass traditionalism in the Catholic Church has found, a number of early 21st century converts. And in part, Latin Mass Catholicism really does connect to the medieval church and the ancient church. It really does go deep into the past. People are not wrong about that. But it also includes elements that are very much belong to the 1800s and to sort of or the early 1900s, these sort of very self-conscious attempts to restore and renew Catholic tradition in the face of industrial modernity, right? But so both things are there, and the same. So the same would be true if you had a successful 21st century religious revival would produce a successful form of religious faith that was inevitably part old and part new or part reinvented at the same time. Then the final point is just on this question. There is, of course, right now, as an alternative to religion or maybe a form of religion, the idea of transhumanism, right? That is very powerful in Silicon Valley right now. It takes sort of, genetic and biological forms. Right now, it's more focused on AI and sort of ideas of digital life and digital intelligence. But there is clearly an idea in human life that maybe you could transcend human nature, right? And get to a point where, in that case, maybe the religious questions would be different or something like that. I don't think that is likely, but it is worth describing as as part of the conversation right now, right? That like there's renewed interest in religion, but there is also transhumanism as an intellectual force in the conversation, especially in elite circles and the most sort of future and forward oriented circles.
Yes, it feels to me a new form of religion. It looks like all of the Silicon Valley executives are dressing alike. They're all going to the gym, working out. They're all into, health and well-being. They're organizing around something, right? And their belief that we can actually transcend some of this human experience and maybe live for, centuries on my own. Like I'm trying to do this on my own. A lot of these scientific discoveries after Copernicus and Darwin made us into a lot of materialists and thinking that maybe if we got rid of the institutions, our mystical experiences, seeing angels and demons and the supernatural will go away. but we've been discovering that the supernatural is encroaching on our world, because it's always there, but it is encroaching on our world in ways where we haven't actually seen for a while, even though it's probably always been happening. So what is happening when you're looking as a journalist? What have you started to discover with near-death experiences and others as they're seeing the and interacting with the supernatural?
Yeah, I mean, so one point to make, right, is that there's an idea that the world was disenchanted by modernity. And this is a very powerful idea, and it's held by secular people and religious people. And I think it's an incomplete way of looking at things. I think that what was disenchanted was what we might call official knowledge, right? Which is to say, if you are a student in a law school and you're writing up, a paper on the history of some legal debate, you would not put in, and then so-and-so cast a spell on so-and-so, right? And, you would not be taken seriously if you included, or similarly, like if you read Wikipedia pages, right? Wikipedia is sort of the official knowledge of the internet. Wikipedia editors are extremely hostile to anything related to the supernatural, right? So there's a kind of official knowledge production that sees itself as necessarily excluding those possibilities. But in terms of experiences, terms of the experiences that people had and the shaping effects they have on individual lives and religious conversions and culture and so on, there's no real evidence at all that religious experience, mystical experience, apparent miracles, healings, and so on, visions, psychic experiences, that any of this became less common under modern conditions. And if you read some of the 18th century rationalists and skeptics, I quote David Hume in the book, there are others, their assumption was, yes, people are credulous, there'll be belief in the supernatural, but once we get rid of established religions and stop teaching people, about the miracles of Jesus and so on, a lot of this stuff will just sort of fade. And it hasn't faded. In fact, if you look at like Pentecostalist Christianity, a lot of the emergent forms of Christianity have been more supernaturalist than a staid kind of Presbyterianism or something would have been, right? That's sort of the baseline. Then you have specific things, and you mentioned near-death experiences, and that is sort of the prime example, specific kinds of mystical experience that have become easier to study and observe under modern conditions because we bring more people back from the threshold of death, right? So we now know more about the kind of experiences that people have on that threshold, and we know that there are sort of consistent seeming experiences across cultures that are not just, sort of garbled hallucinations or whatever you would expect a dying brain to produce, but that map in a very general and not theologically specific way, I want to stress, onto broad expectations about, God, angels, meeting your dead ancestors, experiencing some kind of judgment. There are hellish and purgatorial near-death experiences as well. And this is just a feature of human existence that we know more about than we did a couple hundred years ago. Does it prove that there's life after death? No. But it makes it more plausible than it would have been had we started bringing people back from the dead and these experiences didn't exist, right? So there's changes like that. Then, and last, and here I'm a little less certain where we're actually going, but there is, in this particular moment, in the last 10 or 15 years, just more supernatural interest in the culture. More people, taking psychedelic drugs, doing ayahuasca retreats with shamans and saying, I'm trying, I don't think this is just in my brain. I'm trying to get in touch with the supernatural. People doing the same things in the context of like UFOs, not imagining them to be aliens from Vulcan or Klingon, but like, interdimensional godlike beings, these kind of things, right? And so at the very least, it's a kind of 1970s style moment where there's just a lot of bubbling supernatural interest. How far this goes, maybe it's just, it's a cycle, right? And maybe it goes away. It is possible to imagine things happening that were observed or witnessed, right? That could change how the culture's official knowledge regards the supernatural. I wouldn't exclude that as a possibility. I think the next, 20 or 30 years will be quite interesting in that regard. And people are opening doors, sometimes incautiously and unwisely, in my view. And it will be interesting to see what passes through, if anything.
Yes. And so I have a belief that there are forces of evil and there are heavenly forces of good as well. And we could actually access forces of evil that will really do harm to us and our communities as well.
That is the traditional teaching. And I think that, you know, you can certainly see evidence in the realms of spiritual experimentation where people are operating outside of any kind of formal Christian or otherwise paradigm. Plenty of case studies that seem to confirm, at the very least, that there are spiritual entities out there that don't have our good in mind. And you see, kind of it's amusing, maybe not amusing, right? You'll read literature, for instance, people who are interested in psychedelics or doing psychedelics, and people will say, we keep having encounters with what we call negative entities. What do we do when we encounter a negative entity? And obviously Christianity has some specific views on that. But but people are sort of going out and having encounters. And this is true of mystical experience writ large, right? That like in a secularized society, what you don't get, it's not that mystical experience goes away. It's that people lose a common language to describe what it is, right? People will be like, wow, I had this experience and it seemed sort of ultimate and absolute, but is it really God? Can I use those kind of archaic terms to describe this experience? So there's a lot of that, I think, in the culture right now.
I just randomly picked up Sebastian Junger's new book, In My Time
it's
of Dying.
a great example. Yep.
And, as he has this near-death experience, he sees his father in a vision and sees other things. He then tries to figure out what in the world is this and what happens.
Yep.
And at the end, to me, it feels like, well, I don't know, and we can't really explain it. I'll just be loved by my family and I'll love my family. And so how does this then move us into a place? Why do you think religion actually then organizing into a religion to help us encounter mystery, wonder, the unexplainable in community? Why do you think that is important for us to move into instead of just going, hey, there are unexplainable things. Let's just live our life and love our family?
Hey everyone, it's Joshua here. I want to take a quick moment to say thank you for being part of the Shifting Culture community. If you're enjoying the conversations we're having, it would mean the world to me if you would rate and review the podcast wherever you're listening. Your feedback not only helps others discover the show, but also keeps us inspired to bring you these impactful conversations. And if you're looking to dive even deeper, head on over to Substack at shiftingculture.substack.com, where you'll find extra insights, reflections, and more ways to engage with the topics that we explore here. Finally, if you believe in what we're doing and want to support the show, you can make a donation through the Support the Show link in the episode notes. Every contribution helps keep these important conversations alive. Thanks so much for listening and for being part of this journey to embody Jesus and impact the culture around us.
Yeah, I found the end. Of the Junger book disappointing in that sense, but also characteristic of the phenomenon, that I was just describing, right, where people have these kind of encounters. Barbara Ehrenreich, a political journalist, woman of the left, wrote a book not about near-death experiences, but about mystical experiences called "Living with a Wild God," that had the same kind of flavor as Junger's book. Like, these things happen, these, mystical encounters, they sort of lead her beyond materialism, but she resists the idea that they should ever lead you into organized religion. And I think that's a mistake. I think the best way to describe the mistake, right, is to say, look, these things are not actually random. Right, like if you read Ehrenreich's kind of encounters, or you read Junger's encounters, obviously they're sort of personal distinctives, but they tend to fit reasonably well into the broader mystical traditions. Again, as I said earlier, that sort of show up in multiple world religions, not just in one. Right, so like they suggest that there's some primal reality that different people get in touch with in different ways, but you are more likely to get in touch with when you're about to die, right? And when you combine that with, like, the case for religion that I try and make in the book is a case about converging lines of evidence, right? So it's not mystical experience alone. Mystical experience is really interesting and telling and sort of pushes you in a particular direction, but you want to combine that with the evidence for cosmic design, right? It's like, okay, the universe appears to be organized and ordered, not accidentally, maybe with us in mind. Oh, and our minds, our consciousness turn out to be able to perceive and understand and penetrate the mysteries of this universe in ways we wouldn't have expected. And oh, by the way, lots of people have these mystical experiences that seem to bring them in touch with some absolute form of being and some kind of life after death. I think when you put all those things together, that's a lot of evidence that there's a story going on here. We're part of a story. We don't know all of the story. We don't know everything that's going on, but whatever the story is, on the evidence of Junger's experience and others, it seems like it may be consummated at the end of our life, or at least there's some kind of transition. It seems like some higher agent has put us here for a reason. And oh, by the way, there are a bunch of distinct, but with some convergences, traditions around the world that have spent thousands of years thinking and arguing and talking about what all of this means and what one might do collectively with support from other people, not just on your own, to try and live in some kind of relationship to ultimate reality. Not, you don't have to become a monk or, go live on a pillar in the desert. Maybe some people maybe should, but no, this is, you're going to church on Sunday, right? You're doing, you're doing certain disciplinary things integrated with your normal life that try and keep you connected to the ultimate as well as the everyday. And you're trying to, be a good person and prepare, but in a context where that is oriented towards whatever happens after death and ultimate reality, rather than just towards the secular and the material. And I just think it's really hard to come up with a better system on your own for organizing your life as a response to those realities than what is offered in organized religion. And it's certainly better. Like, it's one thing to say, I've had these experiences and now I'm going to, go off on my own spirit quest and figure things out. I think that has problems, including the problem of demons that we were just discussing, but at least that has ambition, right? At least that is a response. I really don't understand. I mean, I do. It's very human in a way, but I struggle with the kind of shrugging reaction. Like, whoa, that was crazy, man, but I guess I just got to live my life. It's like, no, you need to, in some way, change your life if you think these things are possibly real and possibly serious.
A lot of this spirit guide, we're on a quest to figure out what is happening. We're seekers trying to figure out what's going on in this world. But we in the West, particularly in America, we live in a hyper-individualized culture. It's really about us and our well-being and who we are, and we're going to get ahead. Why do you think organized religion as a construct for community and being in a more communal type area is better for us and more helpful for us in the long run than just saying we're going to then start to organize ourselves in a more communal type culture without religion, but we're going to try to be a little bit more interdependent than we were in the past? Because I think hyper-individualization kind of is a problem in our world, and we need something to help us move towards a different direction.
To be clear, I don't think non-religious forms of community building are bad in any way, right? And if we're just having a conversation about what ails American society, right, I'm happy to place religion. I think it has a big role, but it belongs in a category with other forms of community building and solidarity building as well, right? So there's nothing wrong with saying a response to alienation and isolation and anomie in the modern world is to, join your local kickball league, right? Whatever the equivalent of the bowling leagues of years gone by. There's nothing wrong with saying we need to revitalize the local Elks Club. There's nothing wrong with treating political engagement as a method, as long as you're actually joining a community and not just posting online, right? Like a big part of our problem as a society is that in all things, including religious things, I'm guilty of this, right? People substitute posting for actual engagement. But if you're getting your hands dirty in the world, then you can find benefits from your community garden and your book club and your sewing circle, as well as from going to church on Sunday, right? The case for actually going to church is first the point I made earlier, right? That the things that religion is connected to, life, death, morality, transitions between stages of life, are just a more powerful glue often for community and solidarity than other things, right? So you get a little more solidarity out of religion than other things. But then two, the idea that in fact the things religion is concerned with are important in ways that go beyond their sociological benefits. So I'm very intent on saying you can't just make a kind of utilitarian case for religion. There is one, absolutely. But in the end, you have to be willing to say, and the religious world picture is broadly correct, probably broadly correct. You have good reasons for doing this and potentially eternal consequences if you don't. And it's not just about, the rate of social participation in American society in 2025.
Yeah, that's good. I think one of the stumbling blocks that you write in your book, you have a few of them, but one I think is a pretty big one, is the problem of evil in the world. So let's dive into theodicy just very briefly.
5 minutes or less. Why do bad things happen to good people?
Why is there evil in the world? And is that a deterrent for us to actually have belief in God?
I think it obviously is a deterrent for people, right? Like there's a reason that this argument comes up again and again across history, including in the sacred books of Judaism and Christianity themselves, right? The fact that theodicy is woven into the Old Testament and the New Testament in different ways tells you that it is a substantial issue that religion has to take seriously. My argument in the book, which I stand by, is that having doubts about what God is up to, having, sort of feeling like, how can he possibly be omniscient or omnipotent and all good if he allows, X tragedy or X genocide to happen. Those are issues that should shape your conception of God, right? And should shape your theology in certain ways. They're bad reasons for being an atheist. Because even if you say, I can't get to the omnipotence and omnibenevolence combination, you're still left with all of this basic evidence for design and order in the universe, religious experience, like, the person having the near-death experience, right? If that's real, it's real whether or not it all, the moral logic of God's goodness and the problem of evil adds up in your head. So what are then the plausible responses? One plausible response is to say, I don't agree with classical theism, this sort of philosophical concept of who God is. I think, something else must be going on. And there are other theological schools that have, different accounts of who God is that make the problem of evil at least seem less like an inherent contradiction or tension, right? So, pantheism, where God and the universe are one, offers a somewhat different set of issues. You can be a Gnostic. You can be. I mean, there's a long list. Which, as a Christian, I would prefer that people became an Orthodox Christian. But I would also say it's better to have a heterodox concept of God than to become an atheist, because the heterodoxy has a better argument for it than the atheism. But then I also think that that most of my own tradition seems to signal very strongly that God exists and the problem of evil is one that he expects us to wrestle with. And he doesn't mind it if, we if we do the wrestling in ways where sometimes we feel alienated from him and sometimes we feel angry with him, and all the way up to Jesus himself weeping in the Garden of Gethsemane and crying out in desolation on the cross, right? And I do think as a Christian that the New Testament, the Gospels, the Passion especially, are pretty clearly an answer to the problem of theodicy. They're not an answer in the form of a logical proof, right? You're not saying here it's all mathematically resolved, but they are an answer where, the claim is that God himself has come down and shared our suffering in a very profound and extreme kind of way. And I completely understand why some people confronting the problem of evil are not fully satisfied with that kind of narrative answer. But it is there, I think, and is an important part of what Christianity specifically is offering. But the whole monotheistic tradition, I think, it basically says, yeah, we can't fully resolve this problem. Come on in and wrestle with it with us, because whether or not it fully makes sense, there still probably is a God.
Yeah, that's good. As you mentioned, Jesus and God becoming flesh, living among us, suffered with us and entered into our suffering, took on all of our suffering himself. What really attracts you to Jesus? Why Jesus for you? Why Christianity? And you could go into Catholicism and why Roman Catholic for you, but why Jesus? Jesus specifically?
Yeah, well, I mean, what I just said is part of it, and maybe a really important part of it, because, and this connects to my Catholicism in the sense that I think one of the strongest things that Catholicism does as a liturgical religion is to sort of put the passion front and center in this way that I didn't experience in the same way when I was a Protestant, right? That like you would the Protestantisms that I was part of were very focused on Easter and less focused on Good Friday. And the Catholic tradition, just, the whole build up through Lent, Palm Sunday, through Passion Week, and so on, I think just does a really good job of making the divine response to human evil and human suffering really powerful and potent before you reach the joy of the resurrection. The story of Jesus is a answer to certain questions that hang over monotheism as a tradition. And that is important to me. But then beyond that, I think that, I've been saying throughout this conversation, right, that I think there's good reasons to think that God is present in multiple religious traditions, that there are these convergences and overlaps where people seem to be talking about the same reality, even if they're using different language. At the same time, the reason I'm a Christian and not just a kind of like perennialist or, someone who says they're all basically equal, is that I think that the story in the gospel stands out in a really radical and stark and unusual way among the different stories of religious foundings, prophets, and holy people, right? That, there is a basic historical credibility to the gospels that is, I think, underestimated currently by whatever the secular historical consensus is. I think that, I don't think that consensus is destined to long survive to the extent that it still survives. But I think the Gospels present themselves as, overlapping, credible eyewitness testimony, personal memoir that doesn't seem constructed long after the fact, is not sort of a pious fake, is a real account of something that happened to real people in the full light of recorded history that they did not expect at all, right? That baffled them, and that bafflement is itself apparent in the Gospels. It's not all smoothed away into perfect theological formulations. There's a lot of riddles and uncertainty, and it's like you're reading people working through an experience, right? And that experience was extreme. It was not just, a healing miracle or a sort of one-off sign or signifier, of which there are plenty in history. It was a whole drama, a whole story that, that essentially reshaped the moral landscape of the ancient world in profound ways. Recommend a book like Tom Holland's book, Dominion, about the Christian Revolution, that focuses on that component, right? Just how completely the crucifixion and resurrection sort of inverted a lot of the moral categories that people had inherited. But then it's just sort of, it's this wild and crazy ending, right? Where Jesus comes back from the dead, and in ways that again, if you don't exclude the miraculous, presumptively, are pretty compelling, pretty historically compelling. And I don't think there's anything else quite like it. Again, not that other religious foundings, other religious experiences aren't themselves, or I don't think they're all fake. I think God is there in a lot of places, but I think God seems to be there in a really singular way in the New Testament, and in a way that, for me, makes it reasonable to say, okay, I think there's a lot of divine stuff out there, but this is the controlling revelation. This is the place where God wants you to start. God wants you to read other religious material through this story and this person.
Ross, I think people need to go pick up your book, Believe Why Everyone Should Be Religious. It's a fantastic read. You're a fantastic writer, and your writing in the New York Times and elsewhere has been fantastic as well. So they should check that out too. What hope would you have for your readers if they pick this up and pick up Believe?
I think it depends on the reader. For the sort of curious secular reader who's interested in religion, but feels like it requires too much of a sacrifice of your reason and your confidence in science and your place as a modern person, I'm trying to help that reader get over that sense and realize that no, actually, it is more reasonable than not to become religious. And then for the religious reader, I'm either trying to instill a version of that same confidence, right? A sense that, like, the religious believer doesn't have to be back on their heels and defensive all the time. Of course, there are issues in religion and scandals and unresolved controversies. All that's real. But the basic attitude towards the world has more to recommend it than the alternative. But then also for the religious reader who is, people go through difficult times in their faith life. And people, in evangelical terms, a lot of people end up deconstructing, right, at some point in their life, in some way, something they've inherited or believe they suddenly struggle with. And I'm kind of trying to put a floor under that, right? I'm saying, yes, you may change your mind about a particular idea or a particular doctrine. But at bottom, you should hit a level where you say, okay, but I still should be religious. I'm still doing the right thing. Maybe I need to do it in a different place or with a different set of ideas. But the basic thing is still worth doing, even if you've had a period of struggle and transformation.
That's so good. A couple real quick questions at the end. One, if you go back to your 21-year-old self, what advice would you give?
I mean, that's a tricky question, right? It touches on questions of divine providence. I mean, the worst thing that has happened to me as an adult has been that my family and I moved to a farmhouse in rural Connecticut, fulfilling a sort of fantasy of rural life. And immediately I got Lyme disease and was desperately sick with it for many years. And I'm much better now. But so the simplest thing is to say, go back and tell your 21-year-old self, don't walk in the fields of the house that you just bought without checking for ticks. But this is like a question of suffering thing, right? It's like, okay, but at this point at 45, would I want to lose the person that I've become over the last 10 years? Like, we've had, two children. My wife was pregnant when I got sick. So 2.5 children, let's say, since I got sick. Like, I don't know. I think there are ways in which you don't want to say anything to the 21-year-old self if you have a certain confidence that, that providence has a hand in your life, even the toughest parts.
That's really good and helpful for us as we look back on our life and figure out who we are and where we're going. That's helpful. Anything you've been reading or watching lately you could recommend?
The TV show that I've been watching is the Apple TV show Severance, which just came back for its second season. And it's a show about people who basically have a procedure where they go to work during the day and don't remember the self that's at work. So they have a literal home self and work self, and these have different experiences. And of course, there's, a sinister corporation, and it's sort of probably a little bit like Lost in that way, like various signifiers and so on. So far, it's a good show. It'll probably disappoint me in the end, but it does touch on, it connects to some of the things we've been talking about, the soul, the self, the possibility of a plan, all of these things. Religious issues are never completely absent, even from pop culture.
Yeah. the last episode really
Don't say no.
interesting.
I'm not
You
caught
haven't
up.
seen it?
I'm not.
Okay.
I'm 2 episodes into season 2, so
There's an interesting religious conversation in that. That's all I want to say. Is that
I did notice a lot of churches in season 1, sort of in the background. So
Yeah.
we'll see what I think. Don't spoil it.
I won't spoil it, but I'm just saying it's interesting that there is religious conversation going on and figuring out, hey, what's going on here. Good, Ross. This is fantastic. Is there any place you would like to point people to connect with you, or anywhere specifically you would like people to go out and get your book?
No, wherever, both support your local bookstore, but also it has a very low price on Amazon. So if the price point is an issue, that's the place to buy it. I write for the New York Times. Write and do podcasting for them. That's the primary place they can find me. I'm on Twitter, X, whatever, intermittently. It's a bad habit. Oh, and I should say that for readers who like that sort of thing, I am also serializing a fantasy novel on Substack called The Falcon's Children. So if you want to read a different kind of book about the supernatural, I have that one to offer as well.
Awesome. That sounds great. Fantastic. I'll check that out as soon as we get off now.
All right.
The Falcon's Children.
Falcon's Children on Substack.
Awesome. Well, Ross, thank you for this conversation. I really loved going deep into some of the reasons why people don't believe, and the things that we have started to observe in the cosmos of things that says, hey, maybe there is a creator, maybe there is a God. That actually organizing in religion with God at the center in communal life is a good way to live. Like, we should actually move towards that place. So thank you for this conversation. It was a pleasure to talk to you. I truly enjoyed it.
I really appreciate it as well. Thanks for the opportunity.